as we've discussed, there's not all that much that Mayor Bloomberg has going for him in terms of, say, his record on the issues that progressive voters care about. But climate change was a cause he had claimed to care about and has put major money into. That's why his debate performance last night was, let's just call it confusing or subpar. Anyway, today we're going to hear from Alexander Kaufman about what he said, Bloomberg, and what it means about how he would legislate on the climate crisis. Let me let Alexander into our chat here. Here he is. Alexander, hi. Can you hear us? Can you see us?
I can. Sorry, I'm just
no problem. Hey, you got a haircut and you shaved.
I did. Yeah, that's right.
I love it. Did you do that just for us?
No, I would love to tell you that I did, but no.
Just lie to me. It's fine.
You know what I did? I was like, I went to my stylist and I was like, you got to zhuzh me up. I got to look beautiful.
You're going on act.tv on Twitch. Alex is with us here. He is our climate change person here on act.tv. So this is a great day. 2 Alexes, lots of climate change talk. And in case you're just joining us, Alexander Kaufman is a reporter for HuffPost. He reports on climate change, environmental policy, and the politics of life on our warming planet. So let's talk Bloomberg. At the debate, he defended the fracking industry. It's a transition fuel, he said. We want to go to all renewables, but that's still many years from now. He has deflected blame from China, the world's largest emitter. Can you talk about your impression of Bloomberg at the debate last night? Were his answers about climate change surprising to you?
They were surprising insofar as, this is an issue that he has really pegged his candidacy to. He has pointed out that he has spent tens of millions of dollars on this issue in recent years. He has tried through that philanthropy to get movement on this issue at a time when the Trump administration has been rolling back the few regulations that we had to deal with it. And yet on the stage, given his first chance to really make that case in front of voters and draw distinctions between himself and the other candidates there.
He's like, I'm into fracking.
Yeah, he really struggled to say anything new or surprising or, really anything that sounded impassioned on the issue at all. He really came out the gate saying that, he would rejoin the Paris Agreement on day one. I believe it was Senator Cory Booker at an earlier debate who said that is the lowest possible baseline for any climate policy would be to rejoin that agreement. So there was that. And then he went on.
Bloomberg seems so, I'm sorry to cut you off, but Bloomberg seems so out of touch with the fact that Americans actually are educated in terms of climate change and that we know that it has to be more than that.
Well, right. And, this is following months and months where he wasn't in the race and there has been heated debate on climate change. There was the 7-hour marathon of climate discussions on CNN. There were the various plans that came out between last summer and today from the different candidates. There has been a robust discussion of this. So you would think, particularly after there has been a Jay Inslee in the race, after there has been another so-called climate billionaire in the race with Tom Steyer, that Bloomberg would come with something a little bit more nuanced. He didn't. He instead just talked about, rejoining Paris. He downplayed the emissions from China and said that the real problem was India. And he continued to just kind of make the case for fracking and for increased gas use, despite the fact that his most recent philanthropic effort, which he brought in-house, where last year he set aside $500 million for his own Beyond Carbon campaign, is actually trying to slow the expansion of the gas power plant fleet in the U.S. So this is something that his money is focused on slowing down, and yet he didn't talk about that. He talked instead about how this is an important transitional fuel, and quite frankly, sounded much more conservative on the issue than somebody like a Joe Biden, who has actually put gas executives in high posts in his campaign.
Oh boy. Both of those are terrible news. I notice his Bloomberg's ads when I'm in other states, because he occasionally runs an ad in New York, but not much. they're mostly on his climate policy and gun control, where he has some strength and some record to stand on. Were you uh, were you shocked at his answers, or?
Well, I wasn't shocked at one of his answers, which, he actually started his response to that question by saying that we have been responsible for closing these hundreds of coal plants in the United States and some in Europe. We being a very generous term for the money that he had given to the Sierra Club, and we being even very generous in that case because, as the Associated Press fact checked just a few weeks ago, and did so citing data from the U.S. Energy Information Administration, we is actually the proliferation of cheap gas. The closure of hundreds of coal plants, which has continued since Obama and escalated under Trump, has been the result of just a high operating cost for existing coal power plants and really cheap fracked gas. So, he perhaps we, insofar as he was pitching himself as a supporter of the continuation of fracking and the proliferation of fracking, perhaps we, in that sense, is having some kind of an impact on climate. But that is not what he meant. And
Can
that's
he just retire from the presidency and just keep giving the money to the Sierra Club? Then I'd be like, go Bloomberg, you're doing something good.
Well, the great climate writer, Kate Aronoff at the New Republic, wrote something to that effect, where she said, if he was really a climate advocate, he would be spending the $400 million he's already spent in the last couple of months on ads on unseating some of the climate deniers to whom he has given much money over the years to keep in Congress.
My head hurts. I'm gonna explode. From our chat, Positively Pandemic says Bloomberg is just trolling. He knows, and is probably right, that he can shit money, spread it around, and win. That's a great comment. Here's another question. What's the China bashing all about? China, this is from our friend Toilet Lurker. China was the 44th on the list of per capita emissions in 2018, and US was the 17th. Can you talk about why that's such a trope that China's destroying everything?
Well, China through its industrial expansion over the past few decades has become the largest emitter as a country. Now, keep in mind, China is also the largest country by population. It has over 1 billion people. And it is certainly true that the average Chinese person has much lower emissions than the average European or the average American. Moreover, China historically has much lower emissions than a country like the United States, which entered the Industrial Revolution well over a century ago. So, historically, we are responsible for the majority of the carbon emissions that are now in the atmosphere and that are heating the planet. And the climate change that we're feeling now really does not have anything to do with China. But the long-term projections for the emissions that are being added to the atmosphere and are going to push us past the threshold where we won't really recognize the planet that we're living on, those are things of grave concern. And those are things where we really need to rein it in. And giving China a pass on that, is, not quite honest. They certainly are a huge emitter. India, as Michael Bloomberg said, is also a huge emitter. And it is worth noting that both of those countries have made tremendous strides in terms of deploying renewable energy over the past couple of years. Certainly have done more centralized planning than the United States has, but that still isn't enough. And they still have not come far enough to avert some of the worst case scenarios that scientists are laying out.
Hey, Alexander, I have a question about the efforts that China is doing, because like you said, it was my understanding in the last few years that they were having an enormous pushes towards this massive solar arrays and massive green infrastructure. But I haven't followed up on it in the last couple of years, and I didn't know how much of that was PR, how much of that were actual massive projects. But like you said, it's such a massive population. What is the trajectory that they're kind of heading in, or are they kind of going back to coal? How do you see that?
So actually, in this past year, there were some reports out of Bloomberg New Energy Finance, which is a great consultancy that Mike Bloomberg does own, and
Really? He's in
and
charge of that one?
yeah, and out of a few other groups that found that the rate at which China was deploying new solar and wind and other zero emissions energy sources actually declined pretty significantly between 2018 and 2019. And that it does not mean that there has been a halting of those deployments, but they are not growing at nearly the same rate as they had been from like 2015, 2016, 2017 into 2018. So you are seeing a pretty significant decline in that. They are still once again doing these huge projects, but a lot of the coal plants that they had gotten a lot of great press in 2017, right around the time that Trump was pulling out of the Paris Agreement. They got a bunch of credit for canceling plans to build 104 new coal-fired plants. There are reports based on satellite data and other pieces of data that show that construction on a lot of those plants has actually picked up again. So
no,
some of that was PR, but and the reality that they have been deploying a lot of this stuff is very true. But if you go to Beijing, I was in Beijing a little under 2 years ago. Very clean, very nice. The air was very breathable. It was probably better air quality than New York in a lot of days. But that's largely because they've moved a lot of these factories out to smaller regional cities in order to clean up some of these big global metropolises, that they aren't actually lowering the emissions.
Alex, Senator Warren during the debate last night made the connection between racial justice and climate change, and she talked about the people on the front lines who are really being affected by not just climate change, but some of the other environmental policies that Trump has had. One of our viewers, one of our stream chatters, V for Versa, has asked, the question was, what about Flint? And I'd like to pose it to you. What do you think? Does Bloomberg have a clue that there are human beings being affected by things other than carbon emissions? Because all of this carbon emission talk seems very intangible, yet lead in your drinking water poisoning you and your children is a much more tangible environmental problem. Do you have comments on this dichotomy or his stance on this kind of stuff?
He has gotten criticism in recent days as somebody who helped to fund the re-election campaign of former Republican Michigan Governor Rick Snyder, who was responsible for overseeing that. And as I reported about a month ago, when Bloomberg was mayor, he really worked very hard to oppose a piece of legislation that put new rules on landlords to clean up lead paint dust, which actually affects many more people than lead in water. Lead paint dust. Lead paint was ubiquitous when much of the U.S. housing stock was being built after World War II. And this stuff over time degrades, little tiny pieces fall to the ground, and then if you're a baby crawling around, you're getting it on your hands, and you're putting your hands in your mouth, and you're seeing babies, mostly Black and brown kids in cities with extremely highly elevated lead levels in their blood, which as I'm sure leads to developmental disorders, leads to a host of learning disabilities and other pretty severe problems. And he opposed this vehemently, so much to the point that after it passed in the city council over his veto, he refused to allow the city's general counsel to defend the law against a challenge from landlords, forcing the city council to go out and spend taxpayer money to hire an outside lawyer to deal with it. So this was something that he very vehemently opposed, and there's ample evidence in the decades since to show that he really didn't enforce it at all anyway. So you still have pretty high amounts of lead paint poisoning for people here. So I think his record on that specific contaminant is not great. And his philanthropic efforts have been very particularly focused on things like the energy sector and the electricity sector in particular, which it's notable is only the second largest source of emissions after vehicles.
Do you believe that his philanthropic efforts were really just to lay down, hey, I did good things and now I can run as a Democrat, when really I'm kind of a Republican, but I'm not even, I'm a Democrat light. I'm not even in the party. I'm an independent. Do you think that was his sort of strategy since he left office after 3 terms, after changing a 2-term maximum to a 3-term maximum so he could stay forever? I mean,
I think that may be a cynical and simplistic read on somebody who is a complicated person and who has I mean, there's always going to be nuance when somebody has the personal wealth of some country's treasuries. So is that a factor in it? I would not be surprised. That being said, I mean, I do think that Michael Bloomberg is a data-driven person who has grandchildren, and I should hope, my least cynical read on it is that somebody in a position like his is looking at what's happening in the world and hoping that there will be some kind of response to data. I mean, that has been the kind of business that he has built his career upon, is providing that kind of data and expecting people to act on it. Whether or not he is willing to allow for the type of systemic change that requires him to part with a significant amount of his wealth.
And also, he's going to screw over all his own friends. I mean, he's friends with these people. He's been running in these circles. Right. I don't really see this as a reality-based, any kind of pledge. One of the people in our chat says, hey, a blue MAGA hat. It's a good idea for Bloomberg.
Yeah.
We have some other questions coming in from the chat. The point Vias Versa was making is that Bloomberg could single-handedly bankroll Flint, but is also choosing not to, and yet still keeps talking about being a philanthropist. So there's that point. And then another question from Positively Pandemic, putting aside Bloomberg for a moment, I'm concerned about the melting of the ice caps. What can be done to effectively sound the alarm, in your opinion, Alex, on how serious that is? I mean, 60 in Antarctica is really scary. And also, can you tell us what we're facing right now? Because again, 60 in Antarctica is very scary.
I mean, it would be difficult to summarize in just a few minutes just mounting evidence of how dire the situation is at the moment. We are certainly seeing really severe heating around the poles, which obviously runs the risk of accelerating ice melt, which adds to sea level rise and causes a host of other problems that are even wonkier than that. When you're adding more cold water to northern seas, it changes the way that certain jet streams work, and changes the temperature of different bodies of water, which then changes the type of fish that can survive there, which then changes the way that fishermen and other people who rely on that for their livelihoods and for food can depend on it. So there are many problems that are associated with those types of changes. I mean, what can you do about it? And we are living through a moment where there is a really unprecedented grassroots effort that is international and is well articulated and is being led by young people, by communities of color, by a lot of people who are really alarmed by this and saying that they are uniquely threatened by it. And so get involved. I'm just a reporter. I'm not an advocate myself, but
Come on.
I
know you're supposed to draw a line, but the fact that you're choosing to report on climate makes you an advocate. In my book.
I am most effective if I have the credibility and the room to be able to criticize these movements and these groups when they do something wrong.
Yes, absolutely.
And bolster them when they're doing something good. And so I will say that between movements like the Extinction Rebellion, Sunrise Movement, which has been very influential and remains very influential in this election, and various other campaigns. There are ample opportunities to get involved and get great materials and figure out how you can be most effective, either at shaking your neighbors or knocking on doors or just bombarding Congress people with phone calls and letters urging them to support things like the Green New Deal.
And our final question. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Alex.
Oh, I have a question. Well, I don't know how much time we have, but I'm really curious on your take on this. We were talking about systemic problems and changes, and I'm wondering what your thought is about the different policies that the Trump administration has rolled back, the different environmental regulations and things like that. And there are so many that I have lost track. And so I'm wondering if you can share maybe one or two that stand out to you as the most important ones that have the biggest sort of consequences that you have seen in the last couple of years.
Sure, I'll share two that immediately come to mind. One was that the Trump administration, using what is now widely regarded as completely fudged math, rolled back these fuel economy standards that had been put in place under Barack Obama that would have saved hundreds of thousands of barrels of oil per year, and would have made it cheaper for people to drive their cars. And the automakers were split on it. Some supported Trump, some said this is BS, and we're already building cars that can meet these standards for other countries. We can build them in the United States. So that the Trump administration has had to kind of walk back from a little bit. There was so much criticism and it was so mathematically indefensible, but there is still some change that's expected on that front. And more recently, just last month, the Trump administration finalized its rollback of an Obama-era rule that was called the Waters of the U.S. rule, which expanded federal protections to wetlands and streams that feed into larger bodies of water. And so, the Trump administration claims that this is really helping mom and pop farmers who were going to be burdened by additional federal regulations about what they can or can't dump on their own lands. But in fact, this is going to make it a lot harder to regulate, water pollution and contamination at a time that we are just learning about the magnitude and the scope of these problems and the long-term effects of a lot of these chemicals getting into drinking water.
Yeah. And those are only two.
Yeah.
So do you think a Bloomberg presidency would be on climate better than a Trump presidency?
It would be hard for anybody to be worse than Trump on climate. And I do believe that Michael Bloomberg is somebody who does care about this. I think there's also an argument to be made that Michael Bloomberg is mean and authoritarian enough to really force this kind of stuff through in a way that perhaps the Obama administration was not able to. So that is worth considering. He certainly has been able to wield his tremendous wealth to influence things before. That being said, would a Michael Bloomberg climate policy be equitable, and would it be popular with voters? Would it be something that could be insulated from a Republican president who takes over after him and seeks to roll it back? And would it be something that would spark widespread outrage because workers are being displaced and there's no kind of Green New Deal style program to help them and make sure that they can continue to feed their families? Those are pretty big open questions.
Oh, gosh. Thank you so much for joining us. Our final question from Rye, one of our regular communicators in our stream, is the following. I'm concerned will not meet the required thresholds to mitigate global climate change, and the influx of climate refugees into developed countries might bring rise to more authoritarianism and eco-fascist ideologies due to far greater mass migration than we have now. Do you share my fears, and do you have any thoughts to offer of your own on this topic?
Yes, I very much share those fears. I mean, I think you're already seeing that happen now. The far right generally in Europe and North America has embraced climate denialism. that is starting to shift. You are seeing Marine Le Pen, the far-right leader in France, after seeing the success of the Green parties in Europe's parliamentary elections last March, saying, actually, this is a big issue and we want to turn France into the first ecological civilization, and more disturbingly, then using very Nazi-era blood and soil rhetoric to say that nomadic peoples have no attachment to the earth and therefore have no desire to preserve the integrity of nature in a country. So, you're already seeing that happen. The question is how much we are able to mitigate that and how quickly that spreads as an ideology. I would argue, as many have, that having a type of redistributive and equitable climate policy like the Green New Deal or something along the lines of that both serves to lower emissions, protect people, and expand the social safety net, while also providing meaningful and good paying jobs to people, doing things like planting trees, building out clean energy infrastructure, and really rebuilding the nation. That was the New Deal was effective at quelling fascism in the 1930s in the United States. And I think the argument now is that the Green New Deal could be effective at quelling those same types of ideas in this century. So it's a wait and see, but
it's a wait and see. Thank you so much for being on our program and being a regular on our program. I really appreciate it, and all the work that you do, and just bringing like real, tangible, accurate information to the knowledge base of human culture. It's very important. Alexander Kaufman, reporter at HuffPost, writing about climate change, environmental policy, and the politics of life on a warming planet. Thanks, Alex. We'll see you in 2 weeks.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Alex.